2023 has been a very busy year for Vietnam's foreign relations. Last month, Chinese leader Xi Jinping visited the country, where he and his hosts announced that Vietnam was joining Beijing's Community of Common Destiny, the highest tier in its diplomatic hierarchy. This capped off a busy year in Vietnamese diplomacy. It came less than 3 months after US President Joe Biden visited Hanoi, announcing a similarly significant upgrade to the two countries' diplomatic relations. Vietnam has also announced significant upgrades in its relations with other major powers, including Australia, Japan, and South Korea, with more reportedly on the way. What lies behind this rash of diplomatic activity in 2023? My name is Sebastian Strangio, the Southeast Asia editor of the Diplomat. To explore the busy year in Vietnamese diplomacy, I'm pleased to be joined today by Khang Vu. Khang is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Political Science at Boston College and a Hans J. Morgenthau pre-doctoral fellow at the University of Notre Dame. He's also a regular contributor to The Diplomat, analyzing Vietnam's foreign policy and in particular the country's fraught and asymmetric relationship with China. Khang, thanks for joining us. Now, you've covered these issues in depth for us. Why don't you start off by giving us a quick overview of Vietnam's activities throughout the course of this year? What has stuck out as most significant to you?
Thank you so much for having me on today. So start off, let me give you a brief overview of what happened with Vietnam foreign policy in 2023. Personally, I think that 2023 has been a really one of Vietnam's most prolific years in terms of diplomatic relations. We have, in the beginning of the year, we have a lot of debate about whether the Vietnamese change in leadership will lead to a change in the country's foreign policy. And whether Vietnam abstention vote in the United Nations resolution on Ukraine would hurt its country foreign policy. But as the year has progressed, we have seen that Vietnam has perfectly shown that it has the capability to remain, to stick to its foreign policy of neutrality, and especially its network of comprehensive strategic partnership has increased a lot in the past year. So especially we see that Vietnam is planning or has already upgraded with relationship with several other countries like Japan, Singapore, Australia, and Indonesia to the level of comprehensive strategic partnership. And I cannot complete the Vietnamese story of foreign policy in 2023 without mentioning the two major summits in Hanoi between the Vietnamese Secretary of the Communist Party, Nguyễn Phú Trọng, with US President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. And the months leading to those two summits are nothing short of remarkable. In March, we have a first phone call between US President Joe Biden and the Secretary Chong. And during that phone call, that was the very first time that Chong and Biden had talked to each other in their current role. And again, that showed the US respect of the Vietnamese political system. In April, we have the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, visit to Hanoi, where he actually trying to pretty much push the progress for the negotiating to upgrade the US-Vietnam relations, which has been stuck at a comprehensive partnership since 2013. In June, we have the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier visit to Da Nang, and at the same time, we have Vietnamese Prime Minister Phạm Minh Chính visit to China. In September, we have President Biden visit to Hanoi. During the visit, he upgraded Vietnam relation with the United States to a comprehensive strategic partnership on the same level of relation that Vietnam has with China. And during the same month, Phạm Minh Chính he also went to China and then went to the US for the UN General Assembly meeting. And then we also have a lot of rumors around the same time, around mid-October, and then in November, whether Chinese President Xi Jinping will visit Vietnam, because we always know that whenever Vietnam and the US have some major event in their diplomatic tie, then China would follow with another move that would counter that diplomatic upgrade. So we heard in early December that Chinese President Xi Jinping would be going to Vietnam. And just last week, we see that the Chinese president and the Vietnamese General Secretary of the Communist Party, they agree that Vietnam would join China's Community of Common Destiny, which in the Vietnamese iteration of the phrase translate to the Community of Common Future, which I think is a Vietnamese way to soften the language a little bit because of a high degree of anti-China sentiment in Vietnam.
Interesting. Yes, busy year. Now, as you sort of implied, 2023 saw Vietnam take a number of steps that many observers had previously believed it would be unwilling to take, the upgrade of the relations with the US, skipping over the level of strategic partnership to go straight to the comprehensive strategic partnership, was unusual. Very few people expected that would happen at the beginning of the year. Similarly, with the accession to the Community of Common Destiny, uh, why now? Can you tell us, what lies behind this rash of upgrades in Vietnam's diplomatic relations?
I would say that we cannot deny Vietnam growing agency through its growing array of foreign networks that we have seen in the past year. But in the grand scheme of things, Vietnam is still a really small country amid the US-China rivalry, especially when it borders China. And I would say that the reason why we see a quick upgrade in relation between Vietnam and the US and Vietnam and China is because of regional polarization. We see that ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, we have seen a lot of polarization among the regional partner. Especially, we see that China has pretty much revived its alliance treaty with North Korea, especially in 2021. They agreed to extend the alliance treaty for another 20 years. In 2022, we see that China has not upgraded relation with Russia, but pretty much add substance to the Russia-China partnership by saying that this is a partnership with limits. Especially in the past year since Russia invaded Ukraine, we see that China maintained its pro-Russia neutrality. And on the other side of the geopolitical fault line, we see that the United States has been working really hard to shore up its relations with its regional allies like Australia and South Korea and Japan. Especially earlier this year, we see that the United States trying to really, for the first time, foster to have a trilateral summit between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. So I will see that we have seen the region has been much more polarized in the past 1 or 2 years. So in that circumstance of polarization, Vietnam obviously trying to maintain good terms with both members of the two blocs. We're trying to be neutral. We're trying to be friendly with both members of the two blocs. And I'm not surprised that both China and the United States want to court Vietnam on their side in the growing US-China rivalry. In that situation, Vietnam is being squeezed by the regional polarization. As a small country like Vietnam cannot say no to China. It cannot say no to the United States either, because both countries are vital to Vietnam foreign policy of neutrality. So I would say that because of that kind of squeeze, Vietnam has no other option rather than accepting to US and China's bid to improve relations with this country. But Vietnam doesn't want to be just a pushover in this US-China rivalry. So it's really natural for Vietnam to dampen the degree of regionalized polarization by upping its relationship with other countries in the region, again, by tossing out a lot of comprehensive strategic partnerships with Indonesia, Singapore, Japan, Australia, and last year is South Korea.
Now, the phrase comprehensive strategic partnership seems pretty impressive, but do these upgrades have any real substance to them, or is this more about symbolism and signaling for the Vietnamese government? What function do these designations play in Vietnam's foreign policy? And what do you think they say about the country's foreign relations more broadly?
I would say that the name of the partnership doesn't matter at all. Especially when we look at other cases of Vietnam foreign policy, we know that Vietnam maintains an aligned relationship with Laos, even though Laos pretty much is still pretty much still a Vietnamese partner in name. So, but when it comes to Vietnam relation with other great powers, I would say that the name doesn't matter that much. What really matters to me is the balance of force in the region. No matter what names Vietnam calls China at the end of the day, Vietnam is still a small country. China is still a big country. No matter what Vietnam called the United States, at the end of the day, Vietnam is still far away from the United States. Vietnam and the United States still have difference over their political system. But one thing that is really important to me is that the name is a method to signal the intention. So in a lot of articles that I wrote, the fact that the Vietnamese and the US leadership, they upgrade their diplomatic relation to a comprehensive strategic partnership is a way to signal that the US respect Vietnam communist political system. On the other hand, the fact that Vietnam also joined China Community of Common Destiny is also a way for Vietnam to signal to the Chinese partnership that they respect the Chinese national interest, and they would not do anything that's going to hurt Chinese national interest. That is the fundamental of China neutral foreign policy. Another thing that I want to add is that because the name doesn't really tell you much about Vietnam really true intention behind its foreign policy, we will have to look at other Vietnam policy as well. Especially, I will alert to the one depend principle, which is a part of Vietnam for knows and one depends. So in the one depend principle, Vietnam actually say that depend on the situation and the circumstances, Vietnam reserve the right to foster and upgrade its defense cooperation with other powers that it sees fits. So that tells you a lot that Vietnam doesn't want to be bound by any names or any titles that is assigned to its foreign partners. So at the end of the day, it still depends on the circumstances that Vietnam finds itself in the next decade or so.
Now let's dig in on the US upgrade. Why do you think the US-Vietnam relationship, despite all the progress that we've seen over the past couple of decades, until this recent upgrade, languished at the relatively lowly comprehensive partnership level? And what do you think prompted the Vietnamese Communist Party to leapfrog directly to the top level of the diplomatic hierarchy, the comprehensive strategic partnership? What lies behind this this jump?
I would say that I will attribute the lack in U.S.-Vietnam diplomatic relation in the past decade to China mostly. So Vietnam and the United States, they upgrade relations to a comprehensive partnership in 2013, and immediately in 2014, China tests the partnership by sending the HD 981 oil rig to the Vietnamese waters. So Vietnam actually looked to the United States to see what kind of support it can expect, but obviously that Vietnam only received diplomatic statement support. So there was no concrete material support to Vietnam back then. China again tested the water again in 2017. It pretty much threatened to use force again Vietnamese oil rig at sea, and at that time the Vietnamese look for support from other partners like Russia and the United States. Again, it received nothing, pretty much a statement of support. In 2019, China moved their research vessel to Vietnamese water, which triggered a really huge standoff in the South China Sea. Again, Vietnam deal with China alone. In 2013, past this summer, China sent another research vessel to the Vietnamese water, and Vietnam could not do anything. Pretty much, again, it's seek out for support, but the United States only for some level of diplomatic assurance. I think that the Chinese, they pretty much achieved their goal right there, pretty much showing Vietnam that, hey, no matter how you upgraded your relation with the United States or Russia, you cannot expect the support from this country when we bully you. And especially that you are still a small country, you should not expect to hurt Chinese national interest without any kind of repercussion. So I have to say that Vietnam, the move to upgrade relations with America was pretty much a U.S. diplomatic success. It's not the Vietnamese initiative. So we know that the United States has been pushing for the upgrade for a long time. And this past summer, around June or July, after the U.S. Ronald Reagan visit, the United States has been pushing Vietnam to pretty much leapfrog the upgrade from a comprehensive partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership, so that would make Biden visit to Hanoi more significant. But I would say that even though Vietnam agreed to the upgrade so as to maintain some level of hedging vis-a-vis China and the United States, but at the end of the day, Vietnam has to really lessen the significance of the upgrade by tossing out a lot of comprehensive partnership to other regional countries and welcome President Xi visit to Hanoi to again show China that Vietnam upgrade with the United States do not constitute an anti-China policy.
Right. Now, on the question of the Chinese upgrade, this has been interpreted by some US observers as Vietnam joining an anti-American coalition of some kind with China, despite the historic upgrade that was announced with Biden in September. Now, you wrote for the Diplomat recently that such a skepticism ignores the fundamental logic of Vietnam's China policy. Lay this out for us. What is the logic underpinning Vietnam's relations with China? Does China view its relationship with Vietnam in the same way?
So I would say that Vietnam contemporary China policy is pretty much a result of its painful lesson from the Third Indochina War. So in a lot of my writing for the Diplomat, I always go back to the period between 1975 and 1991, which is the year that we see a complete breakdown of Vietnam-China relations, Vietnam allying with the Soviet Union to balance against China, Vietnam failure to find a military solution to the Cambodian quagmire, Vietnam having to accede to the Chinese demand over Cambodia, and Vietnam finally normalizing diplomatic relations with China on Chinese terms. So those years were really painful for Vietnam. What Vietnam learned from this year was that first, Vietnam cannot expect to rely on extra-regional great power support when its relation with China broke down. That is the first lesson. Second lesson is that Vietnam cannot expect to remain on bad terms with China for eternity. Vietnam can expect to defeat China on a short war on a battlefield, but when it's come to coercion, when it comes to Chinese gray zone tactic, when it's come to other Chinese measure of punishment against Vietnam, Vietnam has no way to withstand those punishment for a long time. So Vietnam pretty much had to give in to Chinese pressure, even though it's still a former ally of the Soviet Union. So those lessons inform Vietnam's current policy towards China, which I laid out is that never never make China upset or angry. And second, that any moves that Vietnam gonna make with other extra-regional power, Vietnam had to reassure China that these moves do not constitute an anti-China policy. So I would say that the Chinese upgrade in that context of Vietnam policy of assurance towards China really fit in that major framework of foreign policy of neutrality. So again, going back to Vietnamese policy of assurance towards China, Vietnam want to show China that even though Vietnam has already upgraded relation with America, it doesn't mean that Vietnam is going to join an alliance network led by the United States to balance against China. Vietnam still value relation with China, and Vietnam hopes that Vietnam relation with China can progress in the future. And I'm pretty glad right now that China is responding to the Vietnamese assuring policy with a lot of positive. So in my other research on Vietnam on China-Vietnam policy, China has been playing along with Vietnam assuring policy a lot. So we see that China fundamental policy towards Vietnam is to keep Vietnam neutral. So long as Vietnam stay being neutral and reassure China is doing so, then China would be willing to play along with Vietnam assuring policy. So to keep Vietnam neutral, China has adopted two policies towards Vietnam. On the one hand, we see that China is not shy threaten Vietnam that they're going to use force against Vietnam to force Vietnam to stay neutral and to force Vietnam to see the limit of its partnership with the United States and Russia. And on the other hand, China is really willing to show Vietnam that, hey, if Vietnam is willing to stay neutral, then China is willing to support the domestic political authority of the Communist Party of Vietnam, and also to support Vietnam economic modernization by tossing out a lot of economic aid program towards Vietnam. And we see that policy at play during Xi's visit to Vietnam, when again Xi Jinping said that he supported the CPV, domestic authority. He hoped that both countries would exchange more party to party in order to maintain the CPV hold on power. And Xi hoped that the community of common destiny would help Vietnam with economic modernization.
Well, fantastic. It certainly cues up a very interesting year to come in 2024, and perhaps we'll have you on again to discuss further developments in Vietnam-China relations and in Vietnamese foreign policy more generally. Khang Vu, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Sebastian.